Sarah. I'm a critical designer from London, as you can tell from my accent. And the work that I'm involved with there is really around the dark matter, the kind of invisible systems that sit behind a technology. I'm not so interested in whether I'm designing for a product or a service or even an infrastructure. What I'm most interested in are the issues of governance, ownership and control that sit behind those technologies. And there are three kind of main themes, I think, that run through a lot of my work. There's a lot of what I do is around emerging technologies, whether that's kind of drones or the dreaded B word, blockchain. And I'm really interested in digital infrastructures. So what is the architecture of the data that supports the product or service that we're using? And also, what's the new civic? And what I mean by that are kind of the civic frameworks that sit beneath the technology. Because I'm pretty sure that most of us in this room are here this weekend because we believe we can do things better. And actually we think that we can do things differently so that we have far more civic emphasis on the technologies that we use rather than commercial emphasis. And as a designer, I can now say after a year of leaving my industrial design masters that I'm only really interested in radical change. I am only interested in design that takes us away from this kind of militaristic, patriarchal society that we have today, that is leading us to a future that we just don't want. So that's where I really want to take design out of its comfort zone, stop designing for status quo, and start thinking how design can link the really exciting kind of decentralized technologies with real user needs to make change. That's the plan anyway. So to start off and to give you some kind of idea of how I've come to this space, I want to talk you through a project that I did for my final master's project last year. It's called the Alternet, and it's a proposal for a civic network, a kind of alternative network where you get to own your own data. And the reasons I started this project were probably reasons that everyone here probably feels quite passionate about too. In the summer, when I was given this kind of open brief to make any project that I wanted to, the Snowden revelations came out. And I was in New York at the time at a Maker Faire building a wiki house, which I'm going to show you later in the presentation. And everyone there was wearing Pebble watches, you know, those Kickstarter kind of smart watches. Everyone was talking about data. And Snowden had, said his thing. And I felt really bothered. At the time, I didn't know why, but I felt angry, I felt worried, and I thought I have to do something about this. I also was becoming increasingly concerned about wearables, particularly Google Glass, because it was still around then. These strange social contracts that we were buying into where, we used to get products with instruction manuals. We now get products with an app and terms and conditions that we have to sign up to. And in those terms and conditions tend to be these strange social contracts, like the Google Glasses don't be a glass hole, 10 commandments. But also recently, I don't know if it was in the press in the US, but certainly in the UK, the story of the Samsung smart TVs that had a clause in its privacy policy that said anything you say in front of your TV may be recorded and sent to third parties as part of our voice recognition services. So as a designer, I was really bothered about the fact that the objects around us will start to betray us because of the networks they get connected into. And lastly, as well, the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, that year had planned a big data sale because they thought it was okay to sell our health data to insurance companies or whoever else wanted it, without any kind of knowledge or idea that there could be a set of principles behind that, which I found deeply worrying. Also, as an industrial designer, that means that I've studied with a lot of people who studied product design. I didn't come from a product design background, I came from an architecture background, but it meant that a lot of what we were looking at was physical stuff. And I think that's quite important when we look at when we talk about networks or MAC addresses, as Gary did yesterday, these kind of invisible systems. And actually it's when they become physical that we can have conversations about them. And particularly this new network that is coming, like the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything as it's called, where every object becomes kind of connected and data conscious. And right now we're already each producing a tsunami of personal data. It's something like 27 million tweets every day from each of us would be the equivalent of the data that we're producing just now. And that's even before we get connected coffee machines and botnet fridges and, you know, connected pots and pans. So this problem of data and also the data economy is only going to get worse. And we are buying into these futures. We're buying these products that are connected because they give us convenience, even though there are huge security risks and all sorts associated with them. And this is a statistic that I use, or a fact that I use quite a bit in presentations. It's something done by a group of MIT students, and it takes 12 points of fingerprint to find you. That's how many points, you know, that makes you you. But it only takes 4 points of data to find you anywhere, which is quite incredible that we're all that unique. So guess what I'm going to say? The big problem with this is privacy. The fact that we have absolutely no control of our data. We don't get to say, like, who can store it, who can use it, what for. And at the moment, we each have gigabytes of data fragmented across the internet, stored in these silos. And this really matters, not because it's Google or Facebook, these kind of centralized big companies taking that information. It's because what we're building, and I think we're all makers in this room, whether we're designers, developers, engineers, philosophers or historians, we all make things, whether we write code, design. And what we build has politics. And I think it's really important to remember that. And because the digital products and services we make are exerting ever greater influence on how power is distributed among us. And as we build new forms of networks or new technologies or new ways of doing, what we're really doing is deciding what rights, powers and capabilities we have as citizens. And I think that's really, it's crucial to understand, and it's something that I go around telling a lot of designers, is it's not just about whether this product will make money, it's about really thinking through like the power that you're giving people. And I think we can do better right now. I think the future we're moving towards is centralized, deeply undemocratic, it's vulnerable, and it's a future where we might all have abundance and automation, but fewer of us in this room will have a job, and everything will be owned by just 1 or 2 companies. And I think that's some dystopia. So the Alternet was designed to kind of respond to this, and there's kind of 3 key areas that I want to just talk through, which is the kind of sharing of the Alternet, because it wasn't designed as a kind of a dark net. What I was interested in doing was kind of finding a middle space between the data control of dark nets and the kind of sharing capacity of the internet, because I was really designing this network kind of for my mum and dad, I suppose. People who are going to want to use a network that empowers them more, but actually is still a network where they could buy their online shopping and get it delivered to their door the next day, where they didn't have to kind of be anonymous. And I was also interested in how we can relate to data. So I was kind of talking about ideas around barometers, and also the connecting us all as peers. And I think this language of like citizens might eventually evolve into nodes or peers, which I'm quite interested in. And ultimately, this whole project was about decentralization, about redistributing power from one central authority to many. So remember, this is a speculative project, so I had to kind of make artifacts that proved or facilitated this kind of speculative future that I was giving. So I looked a lot at the Freedom Network Foundation, and also Commotion Wireless, who I think were here yesterday. I couldn't have done this project without them. and the work that they'd made open. So what I kind of had put together was a mesh network. And I suggested that it started in Hackney, which is a kind of really, it's hipsterville in London, where the few pieces of activist kind of work actually happen, either there or in Brighton generally, which isn't in London. It's a beautiful city by the sea. And what I then did was, because I could go into this speculative future, I then said that we could have kind of community, long hops through a lower Earth orbit kind of constellation of nanosatellites, which funnily enough is now what Virgin are doing. So some of these things that I was suggesting in this project, now big corporations are kind of starting to do, which is interesting. There's kind of weak signals of companies trying to own this kind of decentralized space in some way already. And the hardware that I looked at was 3D printed, because I was interested in how we could have open derivative markets even for routers. And the idea in this first idea was that you would have a kind of unique pattern that you could print on your router so you'd know it was yours. This actually got scrapped. And eventually it became that it didn't matter what form the routers took, that they could become any piece of cornicing or skirting board in your house. They wouldn't have to be a dusty box that sits behind a sofa, forgotten about anymore. Because I'm very interested in this idea of the smart layer in your home and the internet as a kind of magic zone, so that you can go into your house and still feel like you're in control. You can get home, kick off your shoes, dance around naked in your living room to crazy music, because no one will ever know. And I think we're kind of losing touch of that with the Internet of Things and Nest and all sorts of surveillance devices. So I was quite interested in how we could kind of own this kind of intelligent layer. And I also kind of referenced back to early days of Wi-Fi. Bottom left is a kind of is a template. So you could spray the fact that you had the Alternet on your house in the street or on a lamppost, so you could connect. Because I was interested in how we could how networks can bring communities together, or how moments like sharing Wi-Fi could bring neighbours closer. I'm always interested when you log into your Wi-Fi and you see kind of 15 different routers, and some people name them really interesting things, like why aren't you just shut up, be quiet, or and how you can kind of communicate through networks. So also, the routers were tamper-proof. The idea was that you could have them in your home, but also in the streets as well, to kind of make this mesh, this network. So I was kind of also interested in how we could build, literally build the resilience of a mesh network into the actual hardware itself as well. So the idea with these is you literally couldn't get inside to kind of alter any of the hardware, and there were all sorts of other schemes set up with a kind of foundation that I formed in place to look after this Alternet that would really regulate against any kind of malicious hacking or kind of man-in-the-middle attacks, because I was really worried about that as well. So going through quite quickly from that network and hardware, I then was looking at this idea of barometers, and this was just a first idea, and I would love someone in this room to take this idea further. The code is all available. Everything I'm showing you is open source. This idea of how do we understand what data we're giving away, but also what data is being collected about us at any one time. The idea with the barometer was that it would be color agnostic. It would take on the colors of the last organization that would be collecting your data. So if Twitter were collecting your data, it would kind of go into the kind of corporate colors of Twitter. And it was this idea of how can you look into your data and understand that you are producing it? Because right now we're so disconnected from the fact that we are all producing huge amounts of value just by being in this room, maybe tweeting about something I'm saying or posting it to Reddit or whatever. It was really trying to bring that back, and this idea that we had weather barometers. What about data barometers? How do we start to bring some of this into our real life? And then there was also the data licenses, and many of these parts of the Alternet, this kind of speculative project, have been haunting me, and I'm now working on them a bit more now that I've finished. And the data licenses is one of those projects. So this is how you can own your own data, but also share your information. So there's a white paper we've put together about it. Have a look Do comment on it, let me know what you like, what you don't like, what questions you have. So what I was interested in is really applying the same rules of decentralization to our data and thinking about what would it be like if we were able to flip the data paradigm so that we owned our own data. So this was kind of what I came up with. This is a recent rendition. The idea is the data licenses are really connected to Creative Commons licenses. The idea is you get to decide whether you want to share your data. So in this case, this is like household data from a smart thermostat. Do you want to share that data for what kind of purpose? So who can use your information? What can they do with it? And can they share with like-minded organizations under the same terms? And by answering kind of 4 reasonably straightforward questions, the third one gets really sticky. You generate a license for that particular data type. And in the Alternet scenario, you were able to have like 6 licenses for the data about your life, like for biometric, financial, household, etc. And that there was a kind of e-butler that essentially delegated that negotiation process as a result of your licenses. What I've done now is taken the data licenses forward, and we're looking at a kind of transparent marketplace for data. We are looking at a blockchain at the minute. I'm not totally convinced that that's the architecture we need, but we're looking at how data producers, i.e. us, can trade information on a transparent marketplace for data consumers like energy companies or insurance companies to buy. And we're finding that this is really, really interesting because companies know the way that we deal with data right now is really broken, but also they'd be quite interested in being able to buy up a street's worth of, say, non-commercial data that's really good quality, because I know probably a lot of you have looked at databases. Generally, they're a bit of a mess. So if we could share good quality, robust data and get value back for that data, that's a model that seems to be kind of interesting. So what I've been doing is doing a lot of research with users and looking at interfaces like this about how you might set up licenses. And the idea here is to really give the licenses in human speak in a way that, again, my mum or dad would feel quite comfortable with understanding and navigating through. We've been looking at kind of digital certificates, like digital proofs, and there's a project, so I recently worked with the Government Digital Service in the UK. They're kind of the equivalent of your 18F, and similar organisations, on a project called Registers. And there are 2 blog posts right now that I should have linked up. But if you're interested in new data architectures and being able to own data and having a kind of clean permissions layer over your data, do have a look at both those posts. The project's called Registers, and you'll find it in the Government Digital Service blog. And this kind of relates to that. It was the idea of how do you have a digital proof for your license type, rather than having a kind of printout of a JPEG or a PDF. And how can you access your licenses again to edit them if you change your mind? And that kind of links through with this hash, this unique identifier on the top. So what I'm doing with this now is really bringing some of those ideas out of this speculative project into the real world to try and build stuff that people will use, that will make change. And the data licenses, the more I show people, the more convinced I am to keep going. And to try and make this real. I recently was at the V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum in London as well, showing these licenses, and again bringing this network, making the network physical. So you can see on the orange square, there are 3 white items. So I had like a 3D printed Nest, a Oyster card, so travel card, and a Fitbit. And what I was doing was getting the people who were coming by to really understand that like these objects are data conscious, like they are connected in some way to the internet. And so they decide which object they wanted to choose, and I just totally simplified it down into the data types. And they put it across an NFC reader that activated the screens that I just showed you just before, and they went through to build their license. And this is something that I would really encourage you all to do in your work, is to go out and talk to people who are outside of the bubble, the community that have come here today, because those are the people that will tell you how you should be building what you're making. I think it's a totally rewarding, frustrating experience as well. but it really makes you change some of what you think is the right idea into actually what people will probably use. Because I think there's a kind of myth that we can code without users and that we can design without users, and I really don't think we can do either, because what we're doing ultimately is making stuff for people, and I think it's really crucial to engage. So following on from the Alternet, I now just want to talk to you about some ideas some things I'm questioning now in my practice and trying to work on. One of those things is the idea of the city as a computer. And again, thinking through that kind of data architecture layer that I was talking about, whether that's blockchain or distributed ledgers, or we know the way that we link up databases right now is pretty broken. What new data architectures do we need? But also, how will that become physical in a city? Not only through maybe mesh networks and kind of repeater masts, but also thinking through things like home data servers, which I think we're probably going to see in the not so distant future. And also new community centres. So you could have a kind of data server farm at the end of your road. So you could kind of rent rack space at the end of your street. And I think those ideas are really compelling, and also talk about this idea of citizens and nodes and peers and things becoming far more local. And particularly in the UK, we're having big discussions about what kind of model of democracy we want, what leaders we want in. We've kind of got Tory austerity currently, and there are real rumblings of change with a gentleman called Jeremy Corbyn being elected in to lead the Labour Party. And I think people are engaging far more in this idea of local government. And I just think, well, if we want local government, what about local networks as well? Because this all kind of feeds into the same idea of having more localised democracy and communities. So what I'm thinking about a lot is how databases will become physical in our cities. What about public space as well, that's there as physical public space, but also digital public space? And Gary talked yesterday about the Renew smart bins. I don't know if any of you were here for his talk, but we had these kind of smart bins in the City of London that essentially tracked MAC addresses of passers-by. The City of London is a place in London that is the most concentrated area of bankers. So what these bins were doing were following these bankers as they went off to buy their sandwiches for lunch. And no one knew about it. For a long, long while, no one knew what these bins were really doing. They just thought they were telling them what the weather was, because they had a screen on them, because we know that the future of the internet is where everything will be a screen. And eventually we found out that these bins were tracking MAC addresses, and it didn't even make the newspapers in the UK. And that was such an infringement of public space. And at the same time, we had the Taksim Square riots about the hotel that was planned in the public park in Egypt. And fair enough, that was a kind of tip of a pyramid for many people. But I think that the fact we have no way at the moment to protest about our public digital space is a big concern of mine as well. So I'm in part of this city as a computer, thinking about what should online public space be like? How could we have public Wi-Fi that is safe? So earlier I told you about a project called WikiHouse. Well, this is it. So 2 years ago, I co-founded WikiHouse Foundation. WikiHouse is an open source building system. It is like code for space. What it allows you to do is to parametrically design a house in browser. You then, at the moment, the system is based on flat plywood sheets, as you can see here. They get CNC cut, and you can assemble them on site with your friends and build a house over a weekend, which is kind of cool. And this was us putting up a WikiHouse now 2 years ago, 1 year ago, year and a half ago, in central London. It was kind of a prototype building. But what's interesting about this is that the way that we design and build our homes as well is changing. The Internet of Things will change our homes and the way that we understand how we live in those homes. And with WikiHouse, what we've been looking at is really rethinking that kind of intelligent, smart space in a home. And I just kind of wanted to show you these images because if you've never seen WikiHouse before, I think it's really hard to imagine the kind of process I'm talking about, which is very much about empowering people to do it for themselves. We have a big housing crisis in the UK, in London particularly. WikiHouse isn't just about fancy plywood homes, it's also thinking about how we can build a citizen sector for housing. What I'm interested in as well is how we might be able to build kind of LAN networks for kind of private Internet of Things communications in homes. So again, bringing these networks kind of far more local, even just within the house. And as a result of that, my interest in kind of the city and the home, also what new commons will we need? Like what new data commons might we have, particularly with data licenses, if you were able to share your information under common licenses, that we could have pools of really kind of rich quality data shared under new commons where you could go and find information and build what you wanted from it. I think that's something that's really quite exciting. I don't think we've even started to think about what public space online could be. I'm interested in spaces not beyond just Wikipedia, where you could learn and participate and not just consume. And something that I'm also starting to work on a lot more is like, what new custodians do we need for these digital spaces? So as we have, for instance, in the future that I'd quite like to see with data licenses and data ownership, that the technology for those licenses and the commons perhaps that the data is shared into is stewarded by apolitical custodians. And I think it's important because everyone loves building things, but when it comes to maintaining systems, people kind of shy away, and particularly in open source projects, it can be quite hard to incentivize like your group of makers to stay on, to kind of sort out bugs and fix problems. And this is where I think we could be setting up design and technologies for common good, but also setting up new custodians. Do all of you in the room know Ethereum? Yeah? No? Ethereum. Yeah? So Ethereum is a group based in London, and they have built a public blockchain. The way that Ethereum have set themselves up is really interesting in the way that they are a networked kind of organization. And also you should have a look at the way that they kind of, their governance model, like how they can commit code to the blockchain. I think there's some kind of interesting patterns that we could take forward for new institutions, because I think this is what we're really looking at, that our generation will make new institutions for the internet in some form or another. But they might not have to have bricks and mortar and expensive buildings to keep them, that we could be looking at new networked organizations that work remotely, that might just be a team of 10, but really thinking through the kind of governance model and voting system behind how they work. And we already have some, there's a ton of kind of networked institutions already. There's WikiHouse Foundation that I spoke about before. We are a foundation made from members around the world and also chapters around the world. We're not a kind of a centralized organization, and we're trying to be as open as we can. It's hard, but we're getting better. There's also Unmonastery, which is a really interesting group. You should all have a look at them. Obviously Wikimedia, you can't really see this fourth one, but this is Ethereum. And so I think that what we are looking at is not only making new technologies, making new products or services or infrastructures, but we'll also be in the business of making institutions. And I think that's really exciting, because we can make the institutions we want rather than repeat institutions we know are failing and broken. Thank you very much. Hey.
Hi. Great talk. I just wondered, I really liked how straightforward the data licenses that you were developing were in terms of usability. I wondered if you've come across Kevin McCoy's monograph. So actually it was presented in Rhizome about 2 days ago, and it's the reason I'm mentioning it is because it's basically a blockchain application for verifying digital art.
Okay.
Isn't why I mentioned it, but just the reason I'm mentioning it, I guess, is that it has a similar, quite straightforward interface in terms of that you're building a blockchain contract through drawing together different icons, images, rather than actually coding anything. And that's really positive, I guess, in one way. With his project, though, I wonder then about what's happening underneath the interfaces that we actually do need to know about.
Yeah, I think that's a question for all of us, is how transparent do we make the technologies that we're building on top of? Because I think ultimately, like, empowerment is about choice, and to have choice, you do have to understand like how these systems work to a degree. But as my good friend Anab Jan tweeted recently, like, not everyone wants to code, and I think that's really important to remember. But also that the kind of the frustration we have with like the infrastructures today, the kind of way things that we're redesigning, like with blockchain, they are future infrastructures, and as such are things that we probably won't care about that much, and that's okay. Because I think most people just want to have a product that's going to, be quicker or faster or more convenient than anything else. So as a designer, that's kind of a tricky balance to find, I think, between how much transparency do you give versus do people actually really need to care about this so much. But I do think that we need to, one of the frightening things I think about this is that so many people just don't understand the internet full stop, that it's a really kind of a high hill to climb in terms of getting people to even understand like new ways of doing when they don't even understand the basics of where we've started from. And I think that's problematic as well.
Sorry, I realised as I said that it sounded like a criticism. I actually think it's a really
great
thing that you're doing, I think.
And I love criticism. If anyone has any, please tell me. You don't have to love what I've just said.
No, it's not. I guess I had a little bit of criticism with the monograph project, because I do think in that particular, I suppose I'm kind of suspicious of using the blockchain for like reducing artificial scarcity around information goods. But I think it's so important to have people who are thinking about user interfaces for alternative.
But I think trust, like what you just said about being quite skeptical, I think trust is something that we all need to work on. That's really hard, about how do you build trusted technologies.
I don't think you do, though. That's the problem. You kind of pointed to that as well, but it's not something you engineer. I think it's something that happens outside.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's what I mean. Yeah, it's not like it's not. You don't like technically you can't achieve trust, because trust is just between us and the fact that I know Sarah won't have poisoned me giving me this Coke because I kind of trust her. So yeah, it's a kind of human emotion that you build up over time. Yeah.
Watching your talk, it made me think that if you look at corporations, and especially like music producers, film producers, they already have technology to protect their information. It's DRM. So why not retarget DRM to protect our information? Like I don't know if it's technically feasible, but I think that would be an interesting avenue to like take technology that has been developed to protect corporations' data, to use it to protect our data as citizens.
Yeah, I think there's a number of like models of ways that you could probably get data protection. Something that I suppose more interested in is what models are going to be successful for us as individuals and successful for businesses, because I think they're the only models that are actually going to work. And that's what I kind of mean about thinking about decentralized technologies with kind of user needs and trying to make change that way. I think we sometimes fetishize the technologies that we use, which is really easy to do, and it's also really satisfying because you can kind of geek out with what you're making. But I think you then end up with something that maybe isn't so accessible or usable to the people that you wanted to target in the first place. But yeah, I mean, it's a great idea. This was, I guess, talking to both companies and to individuals about information. And that conversation, I think, and I don't even think the data licenses will be maybe the right thing that we need. I'm not necessarily interested in building stuff that's the right answer. What I'm interested in is building and making projects that can bring about change in the way that we're thinking about things as designers, as developers, as makers, to kind of lead to a better way. I don't think that necessarily I will be the one to make the technology to make a huge change. It's more, I'm kind of, the way that I see it is kind of what's the next thing that needs to be worked on, or that we need to start having a different kind of conversation about as a kind of a group of makers really interested in citizen empowerment. Yeah, but I like the idea, yeah. Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. I think the idea of data licenses is really interesting. It seems to me like one of the next steps you could take would be a proposal about how you would design a system like this to scale across the internet. Have you considered how services like Facebook would be designed on top of something like data licenses?
So at the moment and in the white paper, so we've got like a working prototype that's shared in GitHub. The white paper, we've just built a roadmap of how we're going to develop this. And we're going to develop it first off with Smart Citizen, which is a open source hardware kind of sensing kit built in Europe with the Fab Lab network. Is anyone familiar with Fab Lab networks? Yeah, awesome. And what we're going to do is build licenses on top of the Smart Citizen data as a first step, thinking through like the Internet of Things sensors to start with. Data licenses with Facebook, I don't know yet. I think that's hard because like Facebook's business model is built on our data, and what I think we'll see in the next few years is a far greater kind of mixed economy of services. So we know we'll always have the Uber that we have today, but I also think we'll see a cooperative Uber. I hope we'll see a cooperative Uber, and also an Uber that will probably run on a blockchain, etc. And it's kind of how can we use the data licenses on those alternative services, and I think that's where this fits best. Because I think rather than, I really believe in the kind of Buckminster Fuller argument that rather than try and solve or fix a broken system, make a new one that works better. And that's where I see the data licenses. I think the idea of how the license model could spread over other systems, not just Internet of Things, is a really important question. We haven't really started thinking about that yet. So if you have any great ideas, please share them. We'd love to know. At the moment, when I say we, it's me and a group of developers who have started to work on this and see how we can make it real beyond just prototype stage, which is what we've been at so far. But it's a really great point, and I think that kind of mixed economy, I think, is where I think we need to kind of be moving faster a little bit as well with some of this. I think what disappoints me is a lot of kind of mesh network, for instance, technologies end up kind of remaining in this kind of hacky space where it's only for kind of disaster situations, or where you have a group of activists living where they kind of end up popping up. I think we need to try and think about how they can become more mainstream and useful for people. I mean, the fact that when you move into your house, particularly in the UK, it can take 2 months before the internet arrives at your house, and you have to have like a BT engineer. I mean, it's crazy. It takes ages. Yeah, it takes ages. And you have, it can take, they give you like a 2-week window, and generally that doesn't happen because the engineer doesn't turn up, or you're not in, or there's been problems. And you can be waiting ages, which is bizarre. Absolutely bizarre, and it can just be because you want a different contract because the previous internet provider was Virgin and you want to deal with TalkTalk instead.
And so you have a choice there.
Yeah, we do. That's which is different. Yeah. So we have. I mean, it's the same cable, but it's just the it's the price, which is really different to your experience.
Sure.
But like, for instance, with mesh networks, I think there is a real potential to build mesh networks, particularly for like areas of where you have big kind of transient communities of renters, because you have to wait so long for the internet, and everyone gets so annoyed with that. And there's no reason why we should wait so long. It's absolutely ridiculous. But until those groups building mesh networks know how to kind of make them work, and we know that's hard, it's not simple, but connect with those people who are moving into a new home and have to use their 4G for ages because they just don't know what else to do. Until we have those kind of synergies, I don't think it would be a shame if those technologies start to be owned by companies in this kind of new mixed economy. And I think that's what we're starting to see with kind of Facebook's, plan to deliver internet to Africa. The Google Loon project, and now Virgin's nanosite constellations, like constantly owning different layers in this stack. And I just think we need to make them open first before they can be owned, because we're talking about infrastructure, Yeah. Sorry, I totally segued off your point, but it was a good point.
As it relates to where you went with that segue, infrastructure is typically owned by governing bodies because it does have to be maintained and it's a shared resource with both people. Why isn't our approach just have governments, collectivize essentially and take over infrastructure?
I love that point. I love it because I think governments have forgotten their role in making new markets, and that's a problem. And I think in the UK government particularly, there are not enough ministers in positions of power right now who get the internet. They're also at an age where, trying to think of a politically okay way to say this, but it's not their problem. They won't be in power for that much longer. It's the ministers who are older than us, probably a bit. It's their problem to know about this stuff. And I think it's only then that we're going to see change. I think we've got, particularly in the UK, time to wait, unfortunately. But I think that governments have forgotten that role. And I think that what we do need to see is governments realise that public services and public infrastructures can come from the edge. They don't have to be made by government. They certainly need to be supported by government. And there's a whole role of markets to support what those things that we make. And I think we're coming to that tipping point in the UK particularly from my work in government digital service, working with developers who wanted to work on code for civic good, and also with people who were in positions of power within government, that there are many people pushing for that change. But I do think we need to have a greater variety of public services. Like City Mapper, for instance, is such an awesome app. It gets you to where you want to go to. It will link you up with all the different kind of networks you need. Like, why couldn't government have produced a service like City Mapper? It could have. And then that would be in the public domain rather than privately owned. And so I think there's a kind of a space that government need to move into and realise. But I think we can't wait for government. It's too slow. Yeah. But I can link you towards the GDS blogs, and also Tom Loosemore, who gave a talk at Code America just a few weeks ago, and he was talking about this exact point, and that we need governments to stop kind of digitalising paper services and to really become a truly digital government and really rethink services as digital services, as being, people of the internet in an age of the internet. How does that change what government could and should be? And I'd really encourage you to listen to his talk. It's quite long, it's like an hour, but it's worth it. And he gives me a lot of hope for what the government could do, but it's going to take time. Yeah. Tom Loosemore. Yeah, it's a Code for America talk. And yeah, it's very, very good. Yeah. Hi.
I don't really know if I have a great question in here, but I'm just wondering if you're familiar with Alison Powell's work.
I do, yeah.
So around like datification and kind of like what a citizen is sort of going through these transformations as we move towards like smarter sort of digital cities. And I think it's interesting that you are looking into data licensing, because I think part of what she talks about is how we have this mode of engagement as a citizen, which is almost like commodified around data. And I'm wondering if there's a way to sidestep or get out of that instead of like replicate that through licensing. I don't know. That's
Yeah, so I know Alison really well. She's awesome. And yeah, comes from the States but works in London. That's something to say actually, like, and make a point of, is that you're really lucky to have a community like this in New York. In London, the space is really different, and I was just talking to Ingrid about this yesterday. We have a fantastic group of like futurists. We don't really have the kind of like activism layer, i.e. people doing shit. They like to talk about stuff and write about it, but don't do it, which I find really frustrating. So just to make that point, that it's been great to be here this weekend, partly because I realise that we're missing this conversation about very real things. But yeah, I mean, so I kind of think data's already become a commodity and we have to live with it. I don't think we can reverse that so much. And so I sit more in the camp of Jaron Lanier, which is like, data is a commodity, so now what can we do? The point where you start to think about getting value back for data, though, is a point where, like, professionally and kind of, I get a bit lost. Because particularly with the data license model, being able to get value back from your data is really problematic, about competition-based underpricing, who sets the cost for data, like, you know, how does that even really work when we know that Facebook's like advertising information economy idea doesn't really work because the success rate is so slim. It's only because they have so many people working on the network that they can make profit. So I think there's, yeah, it's almost like it's like a can of worms once you start thinking about how you get paid for data, because then you're saying that data is really useful, and there's only a slim percentage of it right now that is. Most of it's just not used. So yeah, there's lots of, there's issues with what I'm talking about with licenses, but I think the idea that you own it, you decide how you share it, is like fundamentally, I think it's convincing, and also what we need, because we know that sharing is actually really useful. But it's just sharing with your consent that's important. Cool. Any more questions or comments? Or awesome. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.